The storm arrived before night had fully fallen. Thunder rolled across the wide frontier like distant cannon fire, and dark clouds swallowed the prairie sky. Wind rushed through the tall grass, bending it low and carrying dust across the open land. Within minutes, the rain followed. Heavy, relentless drops that hammered the earth and rattled every loose board on the lonely ranch house, standing miles from the nearest town. Inside that small house lived Clara Bennett. Once the ranch had been full of voices. Her father had built the place, board by board. Her mother had kept the garden alive through long summers, and later her husband had worked the land beside her. But now the house answered only to silence. Clara sat near the kitchen table with a lantern burning low, carefully stitching a tear in an old shirt while the wind rattled the shutters and thunder echoed through the empty rooms. Storms always reminded her how alone she truly was. She set the needle aside and walked toward the window. Beyond the glass stretched the land she had fought to keep alive, the garden she watered every morning, the old barn her husband once repaired, and the long pasture where the grass struggled through dry soil. Near the road stood the wooden gate that had been broken for years. Clara had tried to fix it many times, but the hinge always gave way again. As she stared out into the storm, something moved near the gate. At first she thought it was only the wind, but a flash of lightning lit the land for a moment, and she saw a man standing there. He was alone, no horse, no wagon, just a tall figure standing in the rain. Clara felt her chest tighten. Out on the frontier, a man walking alone in a storm could mean trouble. She opened the door just enough for her voice to carry through the rain and called out that he was a long way from town. The man lifted his head slightly and answered with a quiet greeting. His voice sounded tired, like someone who had walked far without rest. When Clara asked what he wanted, he rested one hand against the broken gate and said he only needed a place on the porch until the storm passed. He didn't ask for food or a bed, only the shelter of the porch roof. Lightning flashed again and revealed a face worn more by exhaustion than age. Clara hesitated. Life on the frontier had taught her that kindness and danger often arrived together. But the rain was getting heavier, and something in the man's quiet manner made him seem more weary than threatening. She finally told him he could sit on the porch, but the door would remain locked. The stranger nodded, saying that was fair. He walked slowly across the yard and sat on the wooden bench beneath the porch roof, while Clara closed the door and slid the bar into place. For the rest of the night, she watched the storm through the window, occasionally glancing at the silent figure outside. The stranger never knocked again. He simply sat there as the rain dripped from his coat until the storm finally passed. Morning arrived calm and golden. The prairie looked freshly washed, and birds had already returned to the fences. Clara stepped outside with a bucket to draw water and glanced toward the porch. The stranger was gone. She felt a small sense of relief. Travelers often came and went across the frontier, and it was better not to grow used to them. But as she walked toward the gate, she suddenly stopped. The broken hinge was gone. In its place was a carefully carved wooden brace, secured with new nails. Clara pushed the gate gently, and it swung open smoothly for the first time in years. She stared at it in disbelief until a quiet voice spoke behind her. The stranger stood near the barn holding a hammer. He said she was welcome to test the gate. Clara asked if he had fixed it, and he simply nodded. When she told him it had been broken for years, he shrugged and said it only needed patience. She reminded him that he had been supposed to leave, but he replied that it seemed wrong to walk away without repaying her kindness. Clara studied him carefully and finally asked his name. He answered that it was Daniel. When she asked for more, he simply said, "Daniel Cross." He didn't offer anything else about himself. Clara looked again at the repaired gate and then back at him. If he knew how to fix gates, she asked, maybe he knew how to mend fences as well. Daniel allowed himself a small smile and said he knew a little about ranch work. And just like that, the stranger stayed. Over the following days, Daniel Cross worked quietly around the ranch. He repaired broken fence rails, patched holes in the barn roof, hauled water from the well, and sharpened tools that had grown dull over the years. He never asked for payment. Whenever Clara mentioned it, he repeated the same simple answer, that he was only repaying the meal she had given him. At first, their conversations were brief. Clara had lived alone long enough to feel uneasy sharing her space with anyone. But Daniel was different from most men she had known. He didn't boast or pry into her life. He simply worked, speaking only when necessary. Slowly, the silence between them became comfortable. One evening, they sat on the porch watching the sun sink into the endless prairie. The sky glowed orange and red while the wind moved gently through the grass. Clara told him that her husband had built the barn standing beyond the yard. Daniel said the man must have known what he was doing. Clara nodded and quietly explained that her husband had died years earlier during a winter fever that swept through the town. Daniel listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, losing someone that way was a hard thing to endure. Clara looked at him and said he spoke like someone who had lost people too. Daniel remained silent for a long moment before answering that everyone living on the frontier carried losses of their own. About a week later, trouble finally arrived. Two riders approached the ranch in the afternoon, raising dust along the road. Clara recognized them immediately. One was Mr. Caldwell, a wealthy land speculator who had been buying up properties across the region. The other was Sheriff Doyle. Caldwell dismounted with a polite smile that Clara had never trusted, while the sheriff unfolded a document explaining that new tax assessments had been issued for her land. According to the new records, Clara owed $300 in property taxes. The amount felt impossible. Clara insisted she had already paid what she owed, but Caldwell calmly explained that the value of the land had been reassessed. If she couldn't pay the amount within 30 days, the property would be placed in a tax auction. Then he offered another option. He would purchase the land immediately for $200. Clara understood the scheme instantly. The land was worth far more than that. Caldwell had been forcing struggling farmers into these same deals all across the county. She refused the offer, accusing him of trying to steal her ranch. Caldwell simply smiled and said he was trying to spare her embarrassment at auction. Sheriff Doyle folded the document and reminded her that she had 30 days. After the two men rode away, Clara stood alone in the yard feeling the weight of everything she was about to lose. Daniel approached quietly and asked what had happened. Clara explained that the ranch was about to be taken from her through taxes she could never afford to pay. Daniel looked down the road where the riders had disappeared and asked if she was certain there was nothing she could do. Clara shook her head. She didn't have money, influence, or anyone powerful enough to fight men like Caldwell. But Daniel's expression grew thoughtful, as if he were considering something carefully. The day of the auction arrived faster than Clara expected. The courthouse in town was crowded with farmers, buyers, and curious townspeople gathered to watch the sale of several properties. Clara stood near the back of the room with her hands clasped together. The land her father had built and her husband had loved was about to vanish from her life forever. When the judge raised his gavel and announced the start of the auction for the Bennett property, Clara closed her eyes, unable to watch the moment her home would be taken away. Then the courthouse doors opened. Footsteps echoed across the wooden floor. Clara looked up and felt her breath catch. Daniel had entered the room, but he no longer looked like the quiet traveler who had worked beside her on the ranch. He wore a dark, tailored coat and polished boots, and several well-dressed men followed behind him carrying documents and ledgers. Daniel walked calmly to the front table and placed a leather case down before opening it. Inside were stacks of banknotes. When Caldwell demanded to know who he was, Daniel answered in a calm voice that carried through the silent courtroom. He introduced himself as Daniel Cross of Cross Valley Cattle Company. A murmur spread through the crowd. Cross Valley was one of the largest cattle operations in the region. Daniel pushed the money forward and announced that Clara Bennett's tax debt had been paid in full. Then he placed several documents on the table, revealing falsified property assessments used by Caldwell to force struggling landowners into selling their land cheaply. Sheriff Doyle shifted nervously as the judge examined the papers. Within minutes, the auction was canceled. Caldwell and Doyle were escorted out of the courthouse while the authorities began investigating the corruption scheme. That evening, Clara stood outside her ranch house watching the sunset spread across the prairie. Daniel walked up beside her quietly. She told him he could have told her the truth about who he was. He admitted that he could have, but explained that he had been traveling without his name because trust had once been broken in his life. He wanted to know whether kindness still existed when no one knew who he was or what he owned. Clara sighed softly and reminded him that he had fixed her gate before she had even begun to trust him. Daniel smiled and said she had given shelter to a stranger during a storm. They stood together in silence while the evening wind moved through the grass. Finally, Clara asked what would happen now. Daniel looked across the land they had worked together, the repaired fences, the barn, the open gate, and said that depended on her. When she asked what he meant, he said he was wondering if she might consider having a partner to help run the ranch. Clara studied him for a moment, remembering the quiet traveler who had hauled water, repaired tools, and worked beside her without asking for anything in return. Then she smiled and extended her hand. She told him that if he truly meant to stay, they could see what kind of future they might build together, and for the first time in many years, the lonely ranch on the prairie no longer felt empty.